There's a moment in military history that West Point still studies today, not for its brilliance in defensive strategy or logistical planning, but for how completely it shattered every assumption about cavalry warfare. June 25, 1876, Little Bighorn. 210 soldiers dead in roughly 45 minutes. And at the center of that catastrophe was a man who'd spent his entire life perfecting a single tactical innovation, the suicidal cavalry charge that wasn't suicidal at all. His name was Crazy Horse, and to understand how he created the ultimate cavalry killer, we need to go back to where it all began, to a quiet boy who saw something in a vision that would change warfare on the Great Plains forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Around 1840, somewhere in the Black Hills region that the Lakota people called Pahasapa, a boy was born who didn't fit the mold of what a plains warrior was supposed to be. They called him Curly because of his light brown hair, unusual among the Lakota. His skin was lighter than most. He was quiet, introspective, the kind of kid who watched more than he spoke. And in a culture where warfare wasn't just accepted, but sacred, where a young man's entire social status depended on demonstrated courage in battle, being the quiet observer was not exactly the path to glory. Now, to understand what shaped Curly into Crazy Horse, you need to understand the world he was born into. The Lakota in 1840 weren't some static culture frozen in time. They were relatively new to the plains themselves, having migrated westward from the woodlands around the Great Lakes over the previous century and a half. And when they'd arrived on the plains and gotten horses, probably sometime in the early 1700s, everything changed. The horse transformed these people into what many historians consider the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen. Not professionally trained, not drilled in formations, but absolutely lethal in their element. Their warfare wasn't total war in the European sense. It was ritual. It was personal. A young Lakota man proved himself through acts of individual courage that seem almost suicidal by modern military standards. Counting coup, literally touching an armed enemy in battle and getting away with it, was worth more prestige than killing from a distance. Stealing horses from enemy camps required sneaking past guards, navigating unfamiliar territory, and escaping with living animals that could betray your position with a single whinny. These weren't just raids. They were tests. Every encounter was an opportunity to demonstrate courage. And courage determined everything: marriage prospects, political influence, spiritual authority. Young Curly grew up watching this culture, learning its values but standing somewhat apart from it. His father was a holy man, also named Crazy Horse, which tells you something about the family's spiritual orientation. His mother died when he was young. He spent his childhood in that interesting space between observer and participant, watching the older warriors return from raids against their traditional enemies, the Crow to the west, the Shoshone to the northwest, the Pawnee to the south, and then around 1853, when Curly was about 13 years old, something happened that would define the rest of his life. He went on a vision quest. Now, vision quests were common among plains peoples, but what Curly experienced wasn't common at all. He fasted for 4 days on an isolated butte, denying himself food and water, pushing his body to that altered state where the physical and spiritual worlds supposedly merged. And in that state he saw himself. He saw himself riding a horse through a battle. Bullets and arrows flew around him, but none touched him. The horse beneath him seemed to dance through the chaos. He wore simple clothes, not the elaborate war regalia other warriors favored. In his hair, a single feather. Behind his ear, a small stone. On his face, marks like hailstones and lightning. And he rode untouched, invincible, as long as he honored the vision's precise requirements. Think about what this meant to a 13-year-old boy who'd been watching warriors his whole life. This wasn't just spiritual comfort, this was a tactical advantage. If you truly believe you cannot be killed, as long as you follow certain rituals, that changes how you fight. It removes hesitation. It allows you to do things that rational calculation says are impossible. And for Curly, soon to be renamed Crazy Horse after his father passed the name to him, this vision became the foundation of everything. From around 1854 to 1866, Crazy Horse got his education in warfare. The thing is, most of this wasn't against white soldiers. It was against other tribes. The Lakota were expanding their territory, which meant constant conflict with the Crow, the Shoshone, the Arapaho. These were battles between mounted warriors who understood each other's tactics, who'd been perfecting these skills for generations. And Crazy Horse learned. He learned how terrain could hide an approach. He learned how timing could create overwhelming local superiority, even when outnumbered overall. He learned that mobility wasn't just about speed. It was about being where your enemy didn't expect you. But it was his first major encounter with American soldiers that revealed his true tactical genius. December 21st, 1866. The Fetterman Fight. Now, by 1866, tensions between the Lakota and the American government had been building for years. The Bozeman Trail cut right through prime Lakota hunting territory, bringing miners and settlers into the Powder River country. The Army had built forts to protect this trail. Fort Phil Kearny was one of them. And the Lakota, led by Red Cloud in what would become Red Cloud's War, were determined to make the presence of these forts unsustainable. Crazy Horse was 25 years old. He'd been chosen for a specific role in a carefully planned operation, the decoy. Now, understand what this meant. The plan was to lure soldiers out of the fort into an ambush. Not a small ambush, a massive one. Somewhere around 2,000 warriors hidden in the ravines and gullies along Lodge Trail Ridge, just beyond sight of the fort. But to make this work, someone had to ride close enough to the fort to provoke an attack, then lead the pursuing soldiers to exactly the right spot, all while staying just out of range, making it look desperate enough to be believable, but controlled enough to maintain the trap. Crazy Horse rode out with a small group. They showed themselves to the wood-cutting party the soldiers were protecting. They made provocative gestures. They retreated just fast enough to suggest vulnerability. And from Fort Phil Kearny, Captain William Fetterman, who'd reportedly said he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men, took the bait. He led exactly 80 soldiers, cavalry and infantry, out of the fort after these seemingly reckless warriors. Crazy Horse led them over Lodge Trail Ridge. The moment those soldiers crossed that ridge and disappeared from sight of the fort, 2,000 warriors rose from concealment. 40 minutes later, every single soldier was dead. 80 men, complete annihilation. And Crazy Horse's role hadn't been the killing. It had been the part that made the killing possible. The seemingly suicidal charge that was actually brilliant tactical deception. This is where his method crystallized. He'd discovered something profound about cavalry psychology. Soldiers trained in European-style warfare saw a frontal charge as either bravery to be met with disciplined fire or desperation to be exploited. They didn't see it as the setup for a trap. They didn't expect the charging warriors to be the ones in control. And that assumption, that moment of misreading tactical intent, created opportunities. After Fetterman, Crazy Horse's reputation among both his people and his enemies began to grow. But more importantly, he'd found his tactical signature. The charge that looked reckless but concealed calculation. The assault that exploited cavalry overconfidence and the psychological impact of apparent fearlessness. He discovered that in the right circumstances, with the right preparation, aggressive action could break soldier discipline faster than any defensive tactic. He was 25 years old. He had a vision promising invincibility, and he'd just helped orchestrate the worst military defeat the American army had suffered on the plains up to that point. But this was just the beginning. Over the next decade, he would refine these methods, perfect the timing, learn the limits and possibilities of his approach. He would face repeating rifles and learn when not to charge. He would study cavalry tactics and find their weaknesses. And eventually, on a June day in 1876, He would unleash everything he'd learned against a cavalry commander who never saw it coming. But that education, and the price it would ultimately cost, that's a story that deserves its own telling. The Fetterman Massacre, and that's what the newspapers called it, changed the political landscape. The American government couldn't ignore 80 dead soldiers. Red Cloud's war had made the Bozeman Trail untenable, and in 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty officially closed it. The army abandoned the forts. Red Cloud had won. The Lakota and their allies had actually forced the United States government to back down, to sign a treaty recognizing Lakota sovereignty over a massive territory, including the sacred Black Hills. It was, on paper anyway, an incredible victory. But here's where the story of Crazy Horse diverges from many of his contemporaries. Red Cloud signed that treaty. He accepted the reservation boundaries. He agreed to stop fighting. And to be clear, this wasn't cowardice. Red Cloud had proven his courage in battle countless times. This was pragmatism. He saw the numbers, the resources, the industrial capacity of the United States. He chose to secure what he could while he could. Crazy Horse never signed. He never came to the reservation. He remained in the unceded territory, living the traditional life, hunting buffalo, following the old patterns. This wasn't defiance for its own sake. This was a fundamental belief that the Lakota way of life was worth preserving, that freedom was worth the risk. And this choice to remain outside the reservation system made him the symbol of resistance for those who refused to accept the new order. During these years, from around 1868 to the mid-1870s, we start to see Crazy Horse as a complete person, not just a warrior. He fell in love with Black Buffalo Woman, a married woman, which caused enormous social friction. In Lakota culture, this wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. Her husband, No Water, eventually shot Crazy Horse in the face over this affair. Not a fatal wound, but one that left a scar. He later married Black Shawl, and they had a daughter. They are afraid of her. When that daughter died of cholera, probably around 1873 or 74, something in Crazy Horse changed. Friends like He Dog noted he became even quieter, more withdrawn, more focused on warfare. But warfare itself was changing. On August 2nd, 1867, less than a year after Fetterman, Crazy Horse participated in what's called the Wagon Box Fight near Fort Phil Kearny. This time the soldiers were ready. They'd built a fortified position using wagon boxes as barriers. And crucially, they had new breech-loading rifles, weapons that could fire much faster than the old muzzle loaders, that didn't require soldiers to stand and reload after each shot. Crazy Horse and other warriors charged that position, and they were repelled with significant casualties. The frontal assault that had worked so brilliantly at Fetterman failed catastrophically against prepared defenses and superior firepower. This was a brutal education. He learned that his tactics had limits. Against fortified positions with modern rifles, the aggressive charge could be suicide in reality, not just appearance. So he adapted. From 1867 to 1876, Crazy Horse refined his approach. He focused on mobility. He hit surveying parties for the railroads. He attacked mining expeditions. He raided along the established trails. These weren't pitched battles. These were hit-and-run strikes that exploited his advantages while avoiding enemy strengths. He perfected the psychological aspect of his warfare. The sudden appearance out of nowhere. The rapid violence. The equally rapid disappearance. He kept soldiers nervous, kept them defensive, made them scared of the terrain they were supposed to be controlling. Think about what he was doing tactically. He was fighting a guerrilla war against an industrial power, but he was doing it with cavalry tactics that would be studied a century later. He understood that his warriors couldn't match American firepower in a sustained engagement, so he never allowed sustained engagements on his enemy's terms. He controlled when and where fighting happened. He created uncertainty, and most importantly, he preserved his force. Dead warriors couldn't fight tomorrow's battles, but then 1874 arrived, and everything accelerated toward catastrophe. George Armstrong Custer, remember that name, led an expedition into the Black Hills. This was Pahasapa, the sacred center of the Lakota world, guaranteed to them by the 1868 treaty. Custer's expedition was supposedly scientific, but really it was reconnaissance. And what they found was gold. When news of that discovery reached the American public, it was like opening floodgates. Miners flooded into the Black Hills. The government made half-hearted attempts to keep them out, then basically gave up and tried to buy the land instead. The Lakota refused to sell. Why would they? These were their sacred mountains, their spiritual center, and a treaty signed just 6 years earlier, guaranteed their ownership. But by late 1875, the government's position had shifted. In December of that year, officials issued an ultimatum. All Lakota must report to reservations by January 31st. 1876, or be considered hostile. Now, think about that for a moment. January, in the northern plains. They were ordering people scattered across thousands of square miles of winter territory to travel in the worst weather, with all their possessions, their elderly, their children, to reach reservation agencies by an arbitrary deadline. Some bands never even received the message. Others received it too late. And many, like Crazy Horse, had no intention of complying regardless. The government knew this. They were creating a pretext for military action. By spring of 1876, something unprecedented was happening. Lakota bands, Northern Cheyenne, some Arapaho, they were gathering together in numbers rarely seen. Sitting Bull, the spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, was calling people together. His reputation, his spiritual authority, his uncompromising resistance to reservation life, these drew people who wanted to live free, at least for one more season. By June, there were somewhere around 7,000 people camped along a river the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, what Americans called the Little Bighorn. In early June, Sitting Bull performed the sun dance. This was the most sacred ceremony, a test of endurance and spiritual devotion. Sitting Bull danced for days. He had a vision. He saw soldiers falling into the Lakota camp like grasshoppers falling from the sky, falling upside down, falling dead. It was interpreted as a prophecy of victory, and it electrified the gathered bands. Then came June 17th, the Battle of the Rosebud. General George Crook was advancing from the south with over 1,000 soldiers and several hundred Crow and Shoshone scouts. Remember, intertribal warfare didn't stop just because there was a new enemy. Crazy Horse was camped with the gathering on the Little Bighorn, about 30 miles away. When scouts brought word of Crook's column, warriors rode out to meet them. What happened at the Rosebud was a preview of what Crazy Horse would do 8 days later. Crook's force was strong, well-armed, experienced. They had the advantage of organization and firepower, and Crazy Horse charged them, not once but repeatedly. Uphill charges, direct assaults that should have been suicidal against disciplined fire. But each charge was coordinated. Warriors would hit from one direction, force the soldiers to form a defensive line, then hit from another angle before they could reset. The charges were fast enough and aggressive enough that they disrupted the careful discipline that made volley fire effective. And it worked. After 6 hours of this, Crook withdrew. He didn't retreat in panic. This was an organized withdrawal. But he withdrew. A 1,000-man column, with experienced officers and modern weapons, had been fought to a standstill and forced to give up their advance by light cavalry tactics that conventional military wisdom said shouldn't work. Crazy Horse had taken what he'd learned over 2 decades, the mobility, the timing, the psychological impact of apparent fearlessness, and proven it could defeat professional soldiers in open battle. The warriors returned to the Little Bighorn camp. They'd stopped one column, but there were other columns. The army was converging on this massive gathering from multiple directions. General Alfred Terry was approaching from the north, and with Terry's column was the 7th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Crazy Horse had just demonstrated that his methods worked against the best the army could field. In 8 days, he'd have the chance to demonstrate it again. But this time, The stakes would be higher, the enemy more aggressive, and the outcome would become the most studied cavalry disaster in American military history. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd perfected, everything that vision had promised him at age 13, it was all about to be tested in the most extreme circumstances possible. June 25th, 1876. If you were standing on the bluffs above the little Bighorn River that morning, you'd see something that hadn't been seen on the plains in generations, maybe ever. A village stretching for 3 miles along the river valley. 7,000 people. That's not 7,000 warriors, that's total population. Maybe 1,500 to 2,000 fighting men, but also women, children, elderly. 6 different tribal circles: Hunkpapa, Oglala, Miniconjou, Sans Arc, Blackfeet Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne. The largest free gathering of Plains Indians ever assembled in one place. They weren't there to fight. They were there because Sitting Bull had called them together, because the reservations felt like prisons, because this might be the last summer to live the old way. They were hunting, processing buffalo, preparing food for winter, conducting ceremonies. Yes, warriors had just returned from fighting Crook at the Rosebud 8 days earlier, but there was no sense of imminent battle. This was a village, not a war camp. Meanwhile, about 15 miles away, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was making decisions that would define his legacy forever. He commanded the 7th Cavalry, about 650 officers and men. He was part of a larger strategy, 3 columns converging to trap the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne and force them back to reservations. But Custer had ambitions. He'd been a Civil War hero, a boy general at age 23. He wanted another victory, another headline, and he was racing against time, worried that other columns might reach the Indians first and claim the glory. His Crow and Arikara scouts had been warning him for days. The trail they were following showed more people than they'd ever seen. The size of the pony herd suggested a village larger than anything they'd encountered. His chief scout, Mitch Boyer, who'd lived with these tribes and knew their capabilities, reportedly told Custer they were riding to their deaths. Custer dismissed these warnings. He believed, like many officers of his era, that Indians would scatter rather than fight a disciplined cavalry force. His experience told him the challenge was catching them, not beating them. So when his scouts spotted the village on the morning of June 25th, Custer made a decision. Instead of waiting for the other columns, instead of taking time to fully reconnoiter, he would attack immediately. And he divided his force. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen with about 125 men to scout to the south, essentially taking them out of the upcoming battle. He sent Major Marcus Reno with about 140 men to attack the southern end of the village. He took about 210 men under his personal command, intending to strike the village from another direction. Another small detachment stayed with the pack train. His 650 men were now split into 4 pieces that couldn't support each other. Around 3 in the afternoon, Reno's battalion splashed across the Little Bighorn River and charged the southern end of the village. For a few minutes, it looked like conventional cavalry doctrine working perfectly. Mounted soldiers advancing at speed toward a target that should dissolve in panic. But the village didn't dissolve. Warriors grabbed weapons and mounted horses with stunning speed. Leaders like Gal, a Hunkpapa war chief, were rallying fighters within minutes. And suddenly, Reno's charging cavalry found themselves facing not fleeing families, but organized resistance. The thing about cavalry is that it's devastating when moving, vulnerable when stopped. Reno's charge stalled. His men dismounted to form a skirmish line, but that line began taking casualties. Warriors were flanking his position. His Arikara scouts, seeing the true size of the opposition, were already pulling back. After maybe 30 minutes of increasingly desperate fighting, Reno ordered a retreat back across the river. What had been an organized withdrawal became a near panic. Men died in the crossing. Others died on the bluffs beyond. The survivors dug in on high ground and prepared for siege. Custer, meanwhile, had moved north along the bluffs on the east side of the river, probably intending to strike the village from that direction. We don't know exactly what he was thinking because he didn't survive to write reports. But we know he got to a point where he could see the village's true size. And we know that instead of retreating, instead of waiting for Bentine's reinforcements, instead of linking up with Reno, he moved his 210 men into a defensive position on what's now called Custer Hill and the surrounding ridges. This is where Crazy Horse enters the story in full force. He'd been in the Oglala Circle, probably toward the northern end of the village. When Reno attacked, Crazy Horse hadn't been in the initial response. That was mostly Hunkpapa and Blackfeet warriors closer to the southern circles. But as word spread of more soldiers to the north toward his part of the village, Crazy Horse prepared himself according to his vision. He painted his face with symbols of lightning and hailstones. He placed a small sacred stone behind his ear. He mounted his pinto pony. No war bonnet, no elaborate regalia, just the simple preparation his vision had demanded 3 decades earlier. And he rode toward where Custer's men were taking position on the ridges. Now, conventional military wisdom said those ridges were defensible. Custer had the high ground. His men had Springfield carbines and Colt revolvers. They could form defensive positions, create interlocking fields of fire, hold out until Bentine arrived with reinforcements. Warriors attacking uphill against entrenched soldiers with rifles should be slaughtered. Every tactical manual said so. Crazy Horse charged uphill directly at those positions. And he wasn't alone. Hundreds of warriors, Oglala and Cheyenne, charged with him. No cover, no hesitation. A direct assault that looked like mass suicide. But remember everything he'd learned. Remember the Fetterman fight. Remember the Rosebud. This was his tactical masterpiece. The culmination of decades of understanding cavalry psychology and the breaking point of soldier discipline. What happens when trained soldiers suddenly see hundreds of mounted warriors charging directly at them, not breaking off, not seeking cover, just coming at full speed with apparent complete disregard for their own lives? Panic. Not immediately, maybe, but the first cracks in discipline. Men start firing faster than training dictates. The Springfield carbines, single-shot breech-loaders that had to be manually ejected after each shot, began to jam. When you fire too rapidly, the brass cartridges expand from heat and stick in the chamber. Soldiers were trying to pry spent cartridges out with knives, while warriors closed the distance. And here's the crucial tactical insight. Crazy Horse knew that rifle fire is most effective at medium range. Too far, you can't hit reliably. Too close, you don't have time to aim, reload, fire again. By charging at maximum speed, by not giving soldiers time to establish a firing rhythm, by creating psychological pressure that made men fire wildly instead of carefully, Crazy Horse negated the technological advantage. He closed the distance before disciplined fire could break the charge. But it wasn't just one charge from one direction. This was coordinated. Cheyenne leaders like Lame White Man and Two Moons were hitting from other angles. Warriors who'd been fighting Reno were now riding north to join the attack on Custer. The soldiers on those ridges suddenly faced simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Defensive positions that should have been mutually supporting became isolated pockets. Companies that should have maintained cohesion broke apart as warriors got between them. Military archaeologists have studied that battlefield extensively. They've mapped where spent cartridges fell, where bodies were found. And what emerges is a picture of complete defensive collapse. Custer's command didn't die in one last stand, all together in a tight circle like the paintings show. They died in clusters, in groups, in scattered final positions, as the defensive perimeter shattered and warriors closed to ranges where cavalry advantages vanished entirely. Once the fighting became close quarters, once it was hand-to-hand, those cavalry soldiers were doomed. These were men who'd trained to fight from horseback or in disciplined formations. The warriors were fighting in exactly the kind of fluid, mobile, close-range combat they'd trained for since childhood. Clubs and knives and hatchets were more useful than jammed rifles. Speed and individual skill mattered more than unit cohesion. From the moment Crazy Horse launched that uphill charge to the moment the last soldier died, probably 45 minutes passed. maybe an hour at the absolute most. 210 men dead, every officer, every enlisted man. Custer's body found stripped but not mutilated, lying with several others near the highest point. His tactical decisions, dividing his force, attacking without reconnaissance, underestimating his enemy, had created the conditions for disaster. But Crazy Horse's tactical brilliance had executed that disaster with devastating efficiency. Down on the bluffs where Reno had dug in, surrounded soldiers could hear the firing from Custer's position. They could see the dust. And then the firing stopped. When Benteen finally arrived with reinforcements, they linked up with Reno's battered command and held out through the night and into the next day, under siege but protected by their defensive positions. On June 26th, the warriors broke off the attack and the village began to move. They'd won the battle, but they knew what was coming next. Sitting Bull's vision had come true. Soldiers had fallen like grasshoppers into the village. But Crazy Horse had made that vision reality. Everything he'd learned, the aggressive charges, the psychological shock, the coordination, the exploitation of cavalry vulnerabilities, all of it had come together in one devastating demonstration. He'd created the ultimate cavalry killer, not through defensive tactics or superior weaponry, but through offensive action so aggressive it seemed impossible, and therefore broke his enemy's ability to respond rationally. Little Bighorn wasn't just a battle, it was proof of concept. It was validation of methods that conventional military thinking said couldn't work. And it was the high point of Crazy Horse's life as a warrior. He was probably 35 years old. He'd fulfilled his vision's promise. He'd defended his people's freedom in the most spectacular way imaginable. But victories like this don't go unanswered. And the price of this triumph was already being calculated in Washington, in military headquarters, in newspapers across America. The war wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning its final brutal phase. The news of Little Bighorn reached the American public during centennial celebrations, the nation's 100th birthday, and suddenly headlines screamed about Custer's last stand, about savages slaughtering American heroes, about the worst military defeat in the history of the Indian Wars. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect. Outrage, demands for revenge, and most importantly, a massive commitment of military resources to finish what politicians now called the Sioux problem once and for all. The great village that had gathered at Little Bighorn dispersed within days. They had to. 7,000 people require enormous amounts of food, and the buffalo herds couldn't sustain that concentration for long. More practically, everyone knew the army would come looking for them with everything it had. The bands scattered across the northern plains, and the military pursued relentlessly, not with single columns that could be ambushed, but with multiple forces, systematic campaigns, a grinding pressure that never let up. The winter of 1876 to 77 was brutal, not just because of weather, though the cold was harsh enough. But the army had learned from past failures. Instead of withdrawing to winter quarters, they kept campaigning. They attacked winter camps when people were most vulnerable, when mobility was limited, when food supplies were critical. They destroyed lodges, food stores, horse herds. They weren't trying to defeat warriors in pitched battle anymore. They were making survival itself impossible. Sitting Bull took his people north into Canada, into what the Lakota called grandmother's land, beyond the reach of American soldiers. It was a kind of freedom, but also exile, and life there was hard. Crazy Horse made a different choice. He stayed in his homeland, kept moving, kept evading, but the circle was closing. Bands were surrendering. Red Cloud and other agency chiefs were sending messengers, urging the holdouts to come in. Food was scarce. Ammunition was running out, and every week brought news of another group giving up, accepting reservation life because the alternative was starvation. By spring of 1877, Crazy Horse was leading nearly 900 people, men, women, children, elderly, and they were exhausted. They'd spent the winter running, hiding, struggling to find game. On May 6, 1877, Crazy Horse led his people to Fort Robinson in northwestern Nebraska. They brought approximately 2,000 horses. They surrendered their weapons, the rifles and revolvers that had defined them as warriors, as free people. Think about what that meant. These weren't just tools. These were symbols of identity, of the life they were leaving behind. The army was actually relieved. Crazy Horse was the last of the major resistance leaders south of Canada to surrender. His reputation was such that his capitulation meant the effective end of the war on the northern plains. They treated him with a degree of respect initially, though also with wariness. This was a man who'd helped kill Custer. This was a symbol of resistance that the government wanted to neutralize without creating a martyr. Crazy Horse tried to adapt to reservation life. He really did, but he was fundamentally incompatible with it. The agency system required cooperation with chiefs who'd already accepted American authority. Like Red Cloud, it required staying in one place, accepting rations, submitting to the authority of Indian agents who often treated their charges with contempt. For someone who'd lived his entire adult life free, who'd defined himself through autonomous action. This was psychological torture. His wife, Black Shawl, was sick with tuberculosis. He wanted to take her to her parents, needed to care for her. But there were restrictions on movement, suspicions about his motives. Rumors started circulating that he was planning to leave to return to hostile activities. Some of these rumors were spread by other Lakota who resented his status, who saw him as a threat to their own influence with the authorities. Red Cloud, in particular, seems to have viewed Crazy Horse as a rival who needed to be diminished. In early September 1877, tensions reached a breaking point. There was a misunderstanding about Crazy Horse's willingness to scout for the army against the Nez Perce, who were fighting their own desperate war to reach Canada. Some accounts suggest a translation error made it seem like Crazy Horse was threatening to fight against the army rather than for it. The Indian agent ordered his arrest. On September 5th, Crazy Horse was brought to Fort Robinson under the pretense of a meeting. When he realized they intended to imprison him, to lock him in the guardhouse, he resisted. There was a struggle. Accounts differ on exactly what happened. Some say he drew a knife, others say he was simply fighting to get free. What's certain is that a soldier, probably a private named William Gentles, bayoneted him. The blade went into his lower back, punctured vital organs. They carried him to the adjutant's office, laid him on the floor. His father was brought to him. Touched the clouds, a chief and friend stood watch. Crazy Horse died that night, probably around midnight. He was approximately 36 years old, though exact birth dates weren't recorded the way they would be now. His last reported words were something like, "Let me go, my friends, you have hurt me enough." Whether he meant his white captors or the Lakota who'd betrayed him is unclear. Maybe he meant both. Maybe he meant the entire situation that had made his life impossible. They buried him somewhere in the area. His parents took his body and buried it in a secret location that's never been definitively found. There's no marked grave for Crazy Horse. In a way, that's fitting. He'd spent his life resisting the kind of fixed, permanent, controlled existence that a monument represents. But here's the thing about Little Bighorn and Crazy Horse's tactics. They didn't die with him. The battle became one of the most analyzed military defeats in American history. West Point studied it. Military historians dissected it. And what emerged from that analysis wasn't dismissal of Indian tactics as primitive or lucky. It was recognition that Crazy Horse and the other leaders had exploited fundamental weaknesses in cavalry doctrine. The lessons were stark. Don't divide your force without communication and mutual support. Don't underestimate enemy capabilities based on racial or cultural assumptions. Understand that technological advantages can be negated by tactics that close distance rapidly and disrupt disciplined fire. Recognize that psychological shock is a weapon as powerful as bullets. These weren't savage tactics. They were sophisticated cavalry methods that happened to be executed by people white. Military leaders had refused to take seriously Crazy Horse's specific innovations entered the broader understanding of light cavalry warfare. The aggressive charge as a psychological weapon the feigned retreat as a tactical lure, the coordinated attack from multiple directions, creating overwhelming local superiority, the exploitation of terrain and timing to negate firepower advantages. These became recognized as legitimate tactical approaches, studied and sometimes adopted by the same military that had been destroyed by them. His legacy became more than military. He became a symbol of resistance to cultural destruction, of refusing to compromise fundamental identity for survival. He never signed a treaty. He never lived on a reservation by choice. He spent his entire adult life fighting to preserve a way of life he knew was ending. That makes him tragic, but also powerful as a symbol. The Lakota people today honor him not primarily as a military genius, though he was that. They honor him as someone who stayed true to his vision, who lived according to spiritual principles, even when practical calculations suggested compromise. That vision quest at age 13, seeing himself ride untouched through battle, promised him invincibility as long as he honored its terms. And in a sense it was true. He was never wounded in battle, never defeated in direct combat. He survived Fetterman, the Rosebud, Little Bighorn. What killed him wasn't enemy soldiers. It was the impossibility of remaining himself in a world that had no place for what he represented. There's no statue of him based on photographs because he refused to be photographed. There's no confirmed grave because his parents hid it. There's no treaty with his mark because he never signed. What remains is the story. The quiet boy who became the ultimate cavalry killer. The warrior who perfected the art of the aggressive charge until he could destroy professional soldiers in their own element. The man who proved that courage and tactical brilliance could overcome technological advantages. At least for one blazing moment on a June afternoon in 1876, Little Bighorn was the high point and the beginning of the end. Crazy Horse's methods worked perfectly that day. They killed not just cavalrymen, but cavalry confidence itself. But victories like that don't stop empires. They provoke them. And in the end, the military might and industrial capacity of the United States was simply overwhelming. No amount of tactical brilliance could change those fundamental realities, but for those 45 minutes on June 25th, 1876, everything Crazy Horse had learned and practiced and perfected came together in one devastating demonstration. The suicidal charge that wasn't suicidal, the aggressive tactic that concealed brilliant calculation, the ultimate cavalry killer unleashed at the perfect moment against an enemy who never saw it coming. That's the legacy. That's what remains. And that's why we're still talking about him, still studying his methods, still trying to understand how one man's vision quest at age 13 led to the most complete tactical victory in the history of Plains Indian warfare.